Mediators from Oman say the U.S. and Iran have made significant progress in negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. Iran's foreign minister called the latest round of talks in Geneva one of the most intense yet. More talks are set to be held next week in Vienna. They're seen as a last chance to avert U.S. military action. Washington accuses the regime of wanting to build a nuclear weapon, which Tehran denies. For more, let's bring in Behnam Taleblu. He's a senior fellow focusing on Iran and security issues at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a U.S. think tank that advocates for strong sanctions against Iran. Behnam, are Tehran and Washington now any closer to a deal after these talks in Geneva, or are they still on a collision course?
Well, great to be with you. I think the exercise in diplomacy and tough talk in 2026 between Tehran and the Trump administration shows that you can do both at the same time. I think right now, after round three, there was news from the Omani foreign minister who was mediating these indirect talks between the Americans and the Iranians that there will be a round four and that there will be a round four on technical issues, which is a little bit odd if you have no broader political understanding how you can move to an agreement or how you can move to even negotiate on technical issues. So that does look like at least both sides are still trying to hash it out. But make no mistake, both sides are also still trying physically in the real world, in the battle space, to harden their positions. The U.S. is bringing more assets into the region, and the Iranians continue to engage in rebuilding and hardening.
Well, Iran and Oman have been saying there's been progress in the talks. The U.S. has not made any comments about progress. What does that mean?
Well, interestingly, both in 2025 as well as in 2026, the Iranian diplomatic game, the Iranian media game, post every round of negotiations was quite stronger than the American diplomatic ground game following every round of negotiations. Actually, a lot of stuff is being run through Washington, and in particular, the president's public comments and the president's social media feed, rather than that of the individual negotiators. Perhaps that's a matter of style versus substance. But that, in my view, explains why the Iranians are trying to go full court press. They're trying to shape the narrative. And lest we forget, Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, is someone who is just as interested, if not more interested, in winning the narrative war than the real war.
Speaking of the narrative war, earlier this month, Trump said regime change would be the best thing that could happen in Iran. How important are these talks for the survival of the Islamic Republic?
Well, previously, and by previously I mean in the past 2 decades, the Islamic Republic has been talking largely to try to earn sanctions relief. But based on reports for the past 2 weeks now, the Islamic Republic has been trying to front load any kind of conversation with the idea that the Trump administration itself can be the one to economically profit rather than be the one to give major sanctions relief. And the reason for Iran's engagement and the reason for Iran doing this is that substantively Tehran is looking for regime survival because it knows that the chances of a military conflict couldn't be any higher. And in particular, a military conflict that at the very least would at a minimum look like the damage that America and, by the way, Israel were able to impose against the regime, as we saw last summer in the 12-day war. So Tehran is engaging, one, to deter an American attack, two, to potentially impede an American attack, and three, lest we forget, to dishearten Iranian protesters, because President Trump promised support to those protesters multiple times in the month of January. And Tehran thinks the longer that America and Iran are talking, the more disheartened the Iranian people may be, such that if there really is a conflict, that an American or Israeli strike would not beget street protests following that strike.
Now, we are seeing the biggest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East in 2 decades. If there were U.S. strikes, what would they look like?
Depends a great deal on the nature of the targeting operation. You know, would this be decapitation, meaning just to go after one or two political leaders and see if either the street rises up or if there's musical chairs among the political elite, or perhaps the military enters the political scene in a greater way? That's one big question. Another big question is what will the U.S. be doing about the strategic systems, meaning the air defenses, and perhaps most importantly, the ballistic missiles, and then perhaps slightly less importantly, some of the other long-range strike capabilities like cruise missiles and drones, and then what's left of the regime's nuclear program. So the types of military options available are everything from defanging to decapitation to counterproliferation to symbolic strikes to even trying to pave the pathway for regime change. And President Trump thus far has not offered to friends or enemies what the political goal behind the use of force would be.
So you're saying anything could still happen. It's all still on the table. Behnam Taleblu from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks for talking to DW.
Thank you.